During my mom's birthday, my brother's son tossed my son's drawing into the fire and shouted, "No one wants his trash art." Everyone laughed it off. That night, my dad messaged, "You're making this uncomfortable. Just don't come to Christmas." I responded, "So does the funding." By 1 a.m., I had 27 missed calls. At my mom's birthday party, my sister Karen's kid Dylan grabbed my son Ethan's drawing, tossed it straight into the fireplace, and shouted that nobody wanted his crappy art anyway. And the worst part was that everyone laughed. Later that night, my dad texted me saying I was making things awkward and that I should just skip Christmas, so I wrote back that the funding would be skipping too. By 1 in the morning, my phone was blowing up with 27 missed calls, and none of what came from their side was even remotely decent. My mom's 70th birthday was supposed to be a happy milestone, something we all came together to celebrate, but the second Ethan and I walked through their front door, I felt something was off. There was this weird shift in the air, like we didn't quite belong there anymore, like we were just extra noise in our own family. Everyone else had already arrived, Karen and her husband, their kids, and my parents, all of them smiling a little too hard, drinking a little too much, and talking louder than necessary. I recognized that vibe right away. And it wasn't warmth or joy, it was tension dressed up as a party. Ethan had brought a drawing he'd spent days working on, a detailed forest scene with tiny deer standing under a sky full of stars, and he even added glitter even though he hates glitter, just because he thought Grandma might like it. I didn't have the heart to tell him she probably wouldn't care. He handed it to her carefully with both hands, and she barely looked at it before setting it aside like it was junk mail, not even bothering to say thank you or anything at all. I was already bracing myself when it happened, because Dylan, Karen's 12-year-old, picked up the drawing, stared at it for maybe 2 seconds, crushed it into a ball, and threw it straight into the fire. The flames swallowed it instantly, and then he yelled loud enough for the whole room to hear that nobody wanted his crappy art anyway. After that, the laughter broke out, not from the kids but from the adults, with my mom laughing first even though she was the whole reason we were there, Karen laughing so hard she wiped tears from her eyes, and even my dad chuckling along. No one corrected Dylan or told him to stop. Ethan just stood there, and for a moment I think he thought it was part of the celebration, until he looked at me and realized it wasn't. I didn't argue or raise my voice, I just grabbed our coats, told him to put on his shoes, and we left quietly without making a scene. Around 9:30 that night, while Ethan was brushing his teeth, my phone buzzed with a message from my dad telling me I was making things uncomfortable and should skip Christmas. And after staring at it for a moment, I replied that so would the funding. I wasn't bluffing, because for the past few years I'd been sending my parents $3,000 every December to help cover Christmas after my business took off, and they mentioned they were struggling, and I never bragged about it or attached conditions because they were family. This time was different though, and I logged in and shut down the joint account we used. By 1 in the morning, my phone looked like a disaster zone with 27 missed calls and messages from my mom, my dad, and Karen, ranging from "how could you?" to "he's just a kid" to "you're overreacting," and I didn't answer a single one. The next morning I was making pancakes when the front door suddenly opened, and that's when I realized I'd forgotten to lock it, because my parents walked in without being invited and Karen followed right behind them. They didn't show up to apologize, they came ready to fight, with my mom talking about how disappointed she was, my dad saying money shouldn't come with strings attached, and Karen claiming I was teaching Ethan to be weak. I told them they needed to leave, but they ignored me. And then Dylan shoved past me again and headed straight for Ethan while saying something about the drawing. Ethan stepped back, slipped on the rug, and went down hard, scraping his elbow so badly it started bleeding, and even though he tried to hold it together I could see the tears. That was the line for me, and I told all of them to get out immediately. They tried to twist it around, saying it wasn't on purpose, that it was just an accident, that Dylan was only playing, but I didn't care anymore, and I shut the door behind them and locked it. I thought that would be the end of it, but apparently in my family, being kicked out after your grandson shoves a kid and your son says he's done still doesn't count as serious. The next morning the text started, with my mom sending messages that sounded more like damage control than actual concern, saying we shouldn't blow this out of proportion, that everyone was joking, and that I shouldn't take things so personally. Then she dropped the worst line of all, saying Ethan needed to toughen up because life isn't always nice, without saying a single word about what Dylan did, the drawing, or Ethan getting hurt. It was all excuses and deflection. A kid's feelings flattened under the excuse of a birthday party, and a vacation they assumed I'd still be paying for. By noon Karen joined in, And her messages were straight-up attacks, calling me dramatic, accusing me of ruining Christmas over a piece of paper, claiming Mom was heartbroken and Dad was sick over it, and finishing with a jab that my little art prodigy would survive. That last message almost made me throw my phone, but I stayed quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I'd already said it by closing that account the night Ethan's drawing burned in my parents' fireplace. They didn't think I'd actually do it, but now they knew I had. By evening my phone wouldn't stop lighting up with missed calls from my parents, 2 from Karen's husband, and even 1 from a number I didn't recognize, and I let them all go to voicemail while I sat with Ethan helping him sort his art supplies. The first voicemail was from my dad, speaking in a tight, controlled voice like he was trying to hide how nervous he really was, saying he heard the account was closed and asking if it was permanent, explaining they'd already paid for the Christmas trip, that it couldn't be refunded, the kids were excited, the ski gear was bought, and the resort was charging late fees, before ending with a quiet line about how they were really counting on me this year. I didn't respond because what stuck with me wasn't remorse or regret. It was the expectation that I'd keep paying, even if my son was treated like trash. That night my parents came back again, and this time they knocked, and while Ethan was upstairs drawing I opened the door just enough to see them standing there in their coats. They looked like they'd aged a decade in just a couple of days, standing there worn down and tired, and my dad started by saying they just wanted to talk while my mom quickly added that they hadn't realized how upset I really was. I let them come inside, mostly because I wanted to hear the version of events they were telling themselves to justify everything. What they offered wasn't an apology, not even close, just that hollow line about being sorry if I felt hurt and maybe the joke went too far. All wrapped in this clear expectation that we should move on and reset things back to normal so their Christmas plans wouldn't fall apart. It felt less like remorse and more like damage control. And then my mom asked if I could just help them one last time. I asked them straight out if they'd spoken to Dylan at all, if anyone had told him what he did was wrong, and they exchanged a look before my mom said they didn't want to make a big deal out of it because he was just a kid. She even said they didn't want to make him feel guilty over something silly. And that was the moment it ended. I didn't argue or explain myself, I simply opened the door and told them they had 5 seconds to leave, and they did. That night I sat beside Ethan while he quietly worked on a new version of the drawing that had been burned, and this one was different, with no stars at all, just trees and a small boy standing alone at the edge of them with no one else around. He barely spoke, but he didn't need to because I knew then they hadn't just lost the money, they were losing something permanent, and they didn't even realize it had already begun. The ski trip was officially over a few days before Christmas, even though no one bothered to tell me directly, and I found out through Karen's Instagram story showing a sad dining room centerpiece labeled Plan B Christmas with a thanks for nothing caption. It was petty and predictable, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel a little satisfying. That week Ethan and I stayed in our own quiet bubble, baking cookies, hanging paper snowflakes, and making ornaments out of salt dough. And there was no glitter this time because Ethan said it reminded him of the drawing. I didn't push him, and while things weren't magically better, they were calm and peaceful, just the two of us without walking on eggshells for anyone else. On Christmas Eve my mom called with that overly cheerful voice like nothing had ever happened, saying they were hosting a small dinner at home with just family and a few neighbors, and that Ethan should come see his cousin open presents so we could put the tension behind us. I didn't agree right away and told her I'd think about it because I didn't trust them and wanted to protect Ethan, but he overheard and asked if we could go, saying he missed his grandma and maybe everyone would be nicer this time, so I gave in. We arrived around 6, and the house looked the same as always with too many lights, ceramic reindeer on the porch, and Bing Crosby playing from a speaker by the door, and my mom greeted us like long-lost guests, hugging Ethan and acting thrilled we came. Inside, nothing had changed, with Karen barking orders in the kitchen, her husband drinking something dark and strong, and Dylan sprawled on the couch with headphones on, not even acknowledging Ethan. Dinner started around 7 and felt stiff and forced, with Ethan sitting beside me moving mashed potatoes around his plate while my mom brought out her good china, and I remember thinking how interesting it was that the nice things only came out when they wanted to look respectable. Halfway through my dad gave a little speech about family and forgiveness, and everyone nodded along like it was scripted, and then Karen leaned across the table with that tight smile and said we should just hope no one throws a tantrum over paper this time. The room went silent before the laughter came. First soft and then louder, with my mom laughing, Karen's husband doing his awkward chuckle, and even my dad smiling. I looked at Ethan and saw that he understood exactly what she meant this time, and when he dropped his eyes to his plate I stood up, picked up one of my mom's precious porcelain plates, and let it fall from my hand. It shattered across the floor and the room froze, and without saying a word I took Ethan's hand and walked out. No coats, no goodbyes, just straight to the car and gone. After a while he asked quietly if I was mad at him or if he'd done something wrong, and I told him no, that I was proud of him and none of it was his fault. We got home, curled up on the couch with the tree lights blinking and the house smelling like cinnamon and flour, and I made hot chocolate while he fell asleep to a movie. I was just starting to drift off when there was a knock at the door, and then I saw flashing lights outside and a police car parked in front of the house. I opened the door and the officer asked if everything was okay, saying they'd gotten a call about a family dispute and destruction of property, and I calmly told him what happened, that I broke one plate in my own mother's house after my son was mocked again, that we left quietly, and that nothing truly important was damaged. The officer looked uncomfortable, said he understood, and left within minutes, and that's when it really sank in that they hadn't called the police because they were afraid. They'd done it to make a point, to punish me for choosing Ethan, for walking away, and for cutting off their money. They weren't looking for peace at all. What they wanted was control. And this time they weren't going to get it, even though they hadn't realized yet that they'd already lost. After the police left, I stood there staring at the front door for a long minute while snow drifted down outside in those slow, heavy flakes that make the world feel quieter than it really is. Ethan was already upstairs, tucked under his blankets with the small flashlight I'd slipped into his stocking, and he never asked about the cops because I think he understood without needing it explained. Somehow he knew the dinner, the jokes, the laughter, the broken plate, and the flashing lights outside our house were all pieces of something bigger, and that it was finally finished, or at least I thought it was. I expected silence after that, maybe some icy distance, but instead they pushed harder. The next morning Karen left me a 5-minute voicemail that I didn't even listen to, because just seeing her name on the screen made my stomach knot up. And then my mom followed with a text asking if this was really the example I wanted to set for my son. I didn't reply, I just sat on the floor by the couch watching snow pile up against the window, almost laughing at the nerve of that question. As if Ethan hadn't watched his cousin destroy his drawing, get praised for it, and then get rewarded like royalty 3 days later, because yes, that happened. 3 days after Christmas my mom sent a picture to our old family group chat showing Dylan grinning with a puppy in his arms, a gold bow tied around its neck, and the caption said Santa came through after all. It was pure audacity, and they knew exactly what they were doing because that picture wasn't about joy, it was bait, a message saying they were fine, Dylan was fine, and I was the problem. I didn't bite, I left the group chat and deleted the number, thinking that would finally be the end, but it wasn't. On New Year's Day there was something in my mailbox, not a card or a gift, just a single sheet of lined paper folded twice with no envelope, shoved in like it barely mattered. I didn't need to open it to recognize my dad's handwriting, and I read it standing at the sink with a cup of coffee, where he wrote that he raised me better than this, that I'd embarrassed the family long enough, and that I wasn't welcome in their house until I apologized and fixed things. No Happy New Year, no mention of Ethan, just blame and control where love should have been. I threw it in the trash, pulled it back out, tore it up and tossed it again, but I wasn't the first one to really see it. Later that afternoon I found Ethan sitting on the bottom stair holding the pieces in his lap, and he didn't look sad so much as worn out, like a kid who'd learned too much too soon. He didn't ask what the letter meant, instead he asked if we weren't their family anymore. And I didn't answer right away, I just sat beside him and told him the only truth I was sure of, that we were always family to each other and that was what mattered now. That night I packed a small bag for both of us without explaining anything, left our phones in a kitchen drawer, loaded the car and drove north. About 2 hours out there's a small cabin I used to rent before Ethan was born. Nothing fancy, no TV or Wi-Fi, just trees, a wood stove, and quiet you can feel in your bones, and we stayed there for 2 nights. The first morning Ethan stepped onto the porch and stood there staring at the snow, saying it felt like another planet, and I watched him from inside as he sat on the steps and started sketching the trees, the frozen lake, and the chipped red paint on the railing. The second night after dinner he handed me a folded drawing, and it showed the two of us inside the cabin by the fire with perfect details, the blanket over the chair, the cocoa mugs on the windowsill, and the tiny pine tree we'd stuck in a vase, and at the bottom he'd written in big block letters that this is what family feels like. I didn't cry, I just folded it carefully, slid it into my wallet, and held onto it like it was worth more than anything I owned. The next morning before we left he asked if we were ever going back to his grandparents' house, And I told him honestly that not unless they changed, and he nodded and went back to drawing the frozen trees. That's when I knew I didn't need their approval, their invitations, or their letters pretending to be ultimatums, because I already had what mattered and I wasn't giving it up. January went quiet in a way that was louder than all the chaos before it, with no calls, no texts, no passive-aggressive photos, and for almost 2 weeks it was like we didn't exist to them. It should have felt like relief, and in some ways it was, because Ethan slept better, laughed more, and filled sketchbooks again, but there was still this dull ache in me, not longing, just unfinished business. The way it ended, with the police and the letter and the guilt games, felt like a door slammed shut without being locked, and part of me, the part one hated admitting was still there, felt like I needed to try one last time, not for them but for myself. I didn't want to carry this weight into the rest of the year or look back a decade later wondering if there was something else I could have done. So on a quiet Saturday afternoon I made a decision I never thought I'd make again, and we drove to their house. Ethan didn't ask questions, he just packed a few pencils and his sketchbook and got in the car. Because he always knew when something mattered more than I let on. It had snowed that morning, just enough to dust the sidewalks and turn the trees silver. And when we pulled up, their driveway was only half shoveled, like someone started clearing it and quit halfway through. When I knocked, I expected some hesitation, maybe a pause or at least a look of surprise, but my mom opened the door like I was a stranger dropping off a delivery. No hug, no greeting, just a clipped, almost cold "come in." We stepped inside and nothing had changed. The same candles on the mantel, the same framed photos lining the walls, and that same heavy silence sitting in the room like it had weight. My dad was in his recliner with his glasses on and a book in his hands that he clearly wasn't reading, and he glanced up at me for half a second before dropping his eyes back down. Karen wasn't there, and for once I was relieved. I didn't waste time and told them I wasn't there to argue or fight, that I came because I didn't want to walk away wondering if I'd done everything I could, and that I only needed to ask one question, whether they honestly thought what happened to Ethan was okay. My mom lowered herself onto the edge of the couch and let out a long sigh like I was already exhausting her, then said, "Kids fight, that's just what they do, and Dylan didn't mean to hurt anyone, and that I was the one who made it into a scene." Then she looked over at Ethan, who was sitting next to me with his sketchbook open on his lap, and said they'd always loved him and that I was the one keeping him away. I turned to my dad, but he still hadn't said a word and kept pretending to read, so I tried again and told them this wasn't about money anymore or the plate or even the drawing, but about a pattern that had gone on for years, a constant cycle of dismissing, ignoring, and blaming, and this time that pattern landed on my kid, which was a line I wasn't willing to ignore. My mom rolled her eyes and said I'd always been sensitive, that I overreacted, and that I always had, and in that moment everything clicked. That one sentence told me it was never really about Ethan at all, it never had been, because in their story I was always the problem, the one who made things uncomfortable, the one who ruined peace, and believing that meant they never had to change. I stood up, told Ethan to grab his things, and as I turned to leave, my dad finally spoke in a flat, quiet voice, saying, "This is what happens when you raise a boy without a real man in the house." I froze for a second, hoping I'd misheard, but Ethan heard it too and I felt him stiffen beside me. I didn't argue or fire back, I just looked my dad in the eyes long enough for him to look away. Then we walked out without slamming the door or saying another word. During the drive home Ethan stayed quiet and I kept glancing over at him worried, but when we pulled into our driveway he looked at me and said something I'll never forget, that he didn't think they knew how to be sad for other people, only for themselves. I'd never put it that way to him, but somehow he saw it anyway. That night after dinner he handed me another drawing, one of a little boy and his dad walking down a snowy road with a tall house behind them, dark and empty, and across the top he'd written in careful block letters that some doors don't open the right way. I stuck it on the fridge, not to dwell on the hurt, but because it showed me my son understood far more than they ever gave him credit for, and that the door I closed behind us that day wasn't one I'd ever try to open again. January rolled on like it always does, with snow outside melting into dirty, uneven patches like even winter was tired of hanging on, and Ethan settled back into school while I buried myself in work. We made breakfast together most mornings, sometimes waffles, sometimes just toast and apples, and little by little the house started to feel normal again. There was still something lingering under the surface though, not anger or even sadness exactly, just the echo of something that used to be loud and constant and was now quiet but not gone. We didn't hear a single word from them after the day we left their house hand in hand. No texts, no check-ins, not even guilt messages, and I'd been braced for another blow-up, but instead they chose something worse by pretending we didn't exist. That empty space sat with me for a while like a room full of things I didn't want to touch but couldn't throw out. Then in early February an unfamiliar number left a voicemail, and it was Karen sounding calm like nothing had happened, saying she heard we were doing fine, that Dylan missed Ethan, and that maybe the kids could see each other for their sake, because there was no reason to keep punishing everyone over a misunderstanding. I didn't finish listening. I deleted it and blocked the number because the truth is Ethan doesn't miss Dylan. He misses cousins who didn't treat him like a background character. He misses a grandma who looked at his art like it mattered. And he misses the version of family I tried to protect until it shattered with that plate. He doesn't talk about it much, but his drawings say everything. And last week he handed me one showing a row of houses at night with snow on the roofs and every window dark except one, ours glowing warm and gold from the inside. When I asked why only ours had the lights on, he said because that's the one where it's warm. And I just kissed the top of his head and taped it to the fridge. That same night I found the old family photo from last Christmas in my nightstand drawer. All of us in matching sweaters with forced smiles, and after staring at it for a long time I slid it back and face down. Not out of anger or pain but because I finally understood I didn't lose a family, I lost a performance. The gap between how they looked to the world and how they treated us when no one was watching had always been there, and I kept hoping love would close it, but real love doesn't come with conditions or rules or police reports. Real love looks like standing by your kid when the whole room turns on you, walking away even when your hands shake, and starting over with fewer people but more truth. And now our home is quiet but full, with no forced smiles or fake invitations, just me and Ethan learning what peace actually sounds like. And whether they ever change doesn't matter anymore because the door behind us is shut and the one ahead is wide open.